It started a few weeks ago, just after I moved into my new home. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the house seemed perfect, a fresh start after a long year. But it wasn't long before the tranquility had been seeking was shattered by something profoundly unsettling. Every night, just after midnight, I began to hear the sound of children singing a haunting melody on my doorstep. The first night, I was jolted awake by the sound. It was a soft, eerie tune, like a lullaby twisted with discordant notes. Half asleep, I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination and rolled over, trying to fall back asleep. But the song persisted, growing louder and more unsettling. I glanced at the clock. 12:15 a.m. Heart pounded as I got out of bed and crept to the front door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The singing continued, seemingly coming from just beyond the door. I hesitated, then opened it slowly, expecting to find a group of children playing a prank. But the porch was empty. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Confused and unnerved, I closed the door and went back to bed, hoping it was a one-time occurrence. The next night, the song returned. This time, I was wide awake when it started. The same haunting melody, sung by what sounded like a chorus of children, filled the air. I recorded it on my phone, thinking I could analyze it or show it to someone for an explanation. Again, I checked the porch, but it was empty. The song seemed to be disembodied, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I decided to ask my neighbors if they had heard the singing. Most of them gave me puzzled looks and shook their heads, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Delaney, seemed troubled by my question. She pulled me aside and spoke in a hushed tone. "It's been years since anyone talked about the singing," she said. "There used to be an old orphanage where your house stands now. It burned down decades ago. Some say the children's spirits never left." Chills ran down my spine. She told me about the orphanage and the tragic fire that claimed the lives of several children. "They say the children sing to find their way home," she added, her eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the song began again. Armed with my phone and a sense of purpose, I stepped outside, determined to find the source. The singing seemed to lead me around the house, growing louder as I approached the backyard. I followed the melody, feeling a cold breeze despite the warm summer night. The song led me to an old, gnarled tree at the edge of the yard. As I stood there, the singing stopped, replaced by a profound silence. I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and loss emanating from the tree. I began to dig around the tree, driven by an inexplicable urge. After several minutes, my shovel struck something hard. I unearthed an old, rusted tin box. Inside, I found photographs and mementos of the children who had lived in the orphanage, reminders of lives cut tragically short. Among the items was a faded sheet of music, the same eerie melody I had been hearing. The next day, I brought the box to Mrs. Delaney. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked through the items. "They were never given a proper memorial," she whispered. "Perhaps now they can find peace." We organized a small ceremony, inviting the neighbors to honor the memory of the children. We buried the box beneath the old tree and marked the spot with a simple plaque. That night, the singing did not return. The air was still and peaceful, and for the first time since moving in, I slept soundly. The strange and creepy children's song on my doorstep was no longer a haunting reminder of restless spirits, but a poignant echo of a past tragedy finally laid to rest. I've lived in my suburban neighborhood for 5 years, and it has always been a peaceful place. The streets are quiet, children play safely in their yards, and neighbors exchange friendly greetings. But recently, something changed. Every night, just after midnight, a strange noise began echoing through the streets, disturbing the tranquility I had come to cherish. The first night I heard it, I was lying in bed, just about to drift off to sleep. At first, it was faint, a distant, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I sat up, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source. The noise grew louder, a steady, pulsating beat that sent chills down my spine. I checked the clock, 12:03 a.m. Thinking it might be some late-night construction, or a neighbor's late party, I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the sound persisted, growing more intense. I got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the dark, empty street. There was nothing unusual, no sign of movement, just the eerie sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. The next morning, I asked my neighbors if they had heard the noise, but they all shook their heads, looking puzzled. Over the next few nights, the noise continued, always starting just after midnight and lasting for about an hour. It was driving me crazy. I couldn't sleep, and I felt a constant sense of unease. It was as if the noise was trying to communicate something, but I couldn't understand it. One night, determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I ventured out into the darkness. The noise was louder outside, reverberating through the cool night air. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked down the empty streets, the noise led me to an old, abandoned house at the end of the block. The house had been vacant for years, its windows boarded up, and its yard overgrown with weeds. I had always found it unsettling, but now it seemed even more sinister. The noise was deafening here, a relentless thumping that seemed to come from within the house itself. I took a deep breath and approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was musty, filled with the smell of decay. The noise was almost unbearable now, pounding in my ears and vibrating through my body. I followed it to the basement door, which stood open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Slowly, I descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the noise abruptly stopped, plunging the basement into an eerie silence. I shone my flashlight around, revealing old, dusty furniture and cobweb-covered boxes. Then, I saw it. In the corner of the basement was an old, rusted generator, its parts covered in grime. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in the house. As I approached, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls around it, symbols that made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch the generator, and the moment my fingers brushed its surface, the noise started again, louder and more intense than ever. Terrified, I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The basement was plunged into darkness, the noise pounding in my ears, now accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I scrambled up the stairs, desperate to escape. As I burst out of the house and into the night, the noise suddenly stopped, leaving me in a chilling silence. I never went back to that house, and I avoided the end of the block from then on. The noise continued every night, but I tried to ignore it, hoping it would eventually go away. I researched the symbols I had seen, discovering they were linked to old rituals meant to summon and trap spirits. I don't know who or what was behind the strange noise in my neighborhood, but I do know one thing: some mysteries are better left unsolved. The noise may still haunt the nights, but I learned to live with it, always remembering that night in the basement and the sinister presence that lurked within.
Living in the quiet suburbs, I had always felt safe. The neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and any oddity was quickly noticed and addressed. So, when the disturbances began, I couldn't believe something so sinister could happen here. It started with a knock at my door late one night. I had just settled into bed when I heard it, a soft, insistent knocking. Checking the clock, I saw it was just past midnight. Cautiously, I made my way to the door, peering through the peephole. There stood a man, his features obscured by the dim porch light. He didn't seem familiar, and he made no move to explain his presence. Feeling uneasy, I called out, "Who's there?" There was no response, only silence. I watched him for a few moments longer before deciding not to open the door. After a tense few minutes, he turned and walked away into the night. I convinced myself it was just a confused passerby and went back to bed, but sleep eluded me. The next night, the same thing happened. The soft knocking woke me just after midnight. This time, I didn't go to the door. Instead, I stayed in bed, hoping he would leave sooner if he thought no one was home. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, and I heard footsteps recede into the darkness. This routine continued for several nights, and I grew increasingly anxious. One evening, I mentioned the strange visitor to my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Her face paled, and she exchanged a worried glance with her husband. "You shouldn't answer the door," she said urgently. "Years ago, a man used to knock on doors late at night around here. People said he was harmless, but one night, a woman disappeared after opening the door to him. No one ever saw her again." The story sent chills down my spine. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I set up a security camera on my porch. That night, I stayed awake, waiting for the knocking to start. Sure enough, just after midnight, the soft rapping began. I watched the live feed on my phone as the man approached my door. He stood there, as always, knocking rhythmically. I zoomed in, trying to get a clearer look at his face, but it was always just out of focus, like he was shrouded in shadow. The next day, I reviewed the footage with my neighbor. To our shock, the camera showed the man approaching but never quite captured his face. It was as if he was a shadow, a figure without detail. Even more unsettling, there was a moment when he seemed to look directly into the camera, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I decided to involve the police. They took my report seriously, but had little to go on. They promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but I could tell they were skeptical. That night, I tried to sleep, feeling somewhat reassured by their presence. The knocking came again, relentless and eerie. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I crept to the door, phone in hand, ready to call the police. Peering through the peephole, I saw him again, standing perfectly still, his face still hidden. I dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the man outside. She assured me officers were on their way. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, and I heard the sound of footsteps retreating. The police arrived shortly after, but the man was gone. They searched the area and found no trace of him. Frustrated and scared, I asked what more I could do. They suggested additional security measures and to call them immediately if he returned. For several nights, I stayed with friends, unable to face the creeping dread that had taken over my home. Eventually, I had to return. The first few nights were quiet, and I began to hope that maybe the man had moved on. Then, one night, the knocking resumed. This time, it was louder, more urgent. I didn't go to the door. Instead, I called the police again. As I waited for them to arrive, I felt a strange compulsion to open the door, like an unseen force was urging me to let him in. I resisted, trembling with fear. When the police arrived, the man was gone, but this time they found something, a piece of paper wedged into my doorframe. It was a note, written in a shaky hand. "Let me in!" That was the final straw. I moved out the next day, unable to endure another night of terror. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget those nights of relentless knocking, the strange compulsion, and the haunting words of that final note.